Thank you for joining us here at the Wilson Center today. We are congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan. So today I'm joined by Baroness Cathy Ashton, who was Vice President of the European Commission and High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union from 2009 to 2014. She is also the Wilson Center's Slater Family Distinguished Scholar, which makes her one of our own. As part of the Wilson Center's new Ukraine in Europe initiative, Baroness Ashton joins me today for a discussion of Ukraine's EU candidacy and how its European trajectory will change the EU's current foreign and security policy orientation. And as you can read in her book, titled And Then What? Stories from 21st Century Diplomacy, Cathy brings great experience from her EU work to our discussion of Ukraine today. So Cathy, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Robin. Lovely to be here.
So I'd like to start a little bit with how you saw firsthand Ukraine's commitment to its EU trajectory when you were High Rep. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
You know, there'd always been discussion about how far the EU would enlarge, how many countries would become members. And I always say to people, it's an interesting project because there are always at least 7 countries who want to come into the EU. I think there are currently 9. The Ukrainian people were increasingly interested in developing that relationship with Europe. Indeed, the President Yanukovych, who's the one who left and who didn't sign the agreement, well, he'd stood on a platform of getting closer to Europe. So there was a very definite move in that direction. And the association agreement, which is currently what Ukraine has with the EU, is often, not always, but often a step going in the direction better trade links, better collaboration on institutional reform, better development together in terms of values. That was very obviously the direction of travel that we saw. So right from 2010 onwards, but certainly, of course, by the time of the beginning of Russia's invasion, which is a decade ago, you saw the commitment of Ukraine to becoming a part of the EU, recognizing that was going to be quite a journey.
Indeed. You know, one of the things that struck me last week when Ursula von der Leyen gave her speech on the state of the European Union, when she turned to Ukraine, she talked about its future as part of the EU, and she saw it as a completion of the European Union, part of that process. She also saw it as a catalyst for progress in the EU. How will the process of bringing Ukraine and the Western Balkans, ultimately Moldova, other potential candidates, how will that prompt progress of completing the European Union?
Well, I think there has to come a point when the EU believes it's complete. And I think what she was not just alluding to, I think what she was saying was, once you have those countries inside the European Union, you've really gone as far as that's possible to go geographically. You can think about Turkey. We still have to think about that in a much longer term, I guess. But in the context of looking eastward, and as you've rightly pointed out, the Western Balkans for sure, then that sort of finishes the project. But I think she was also saying something else, which is in order to achieve that, in order to bring 40 million people in, you're going to have to think about the project itself, about the EU's institutional framework, which, after all, as you and I know well, was designed in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and arguably needs to be updated, if that's the right word, to reflect the changes. And if you're going to have, in the end, 35, 36, 37 countries as part of the EU, you have to think realistically about what does that mean for how the institutions are set up.
Does that mean that treaty change is necessary for the EU, that they should be looking at that? And can that happen simultaneously with the enlargement process? Von der Leyen seemed to imply that that was the case. Tell me how you see that.
There is some speculation that you would do the treaty to bring in Ukraine and the treaty to make the changes in the EU at the same time. Generally, there is a desire to stay far, far away from treaty change within the EU. It implies all kinds of things. Governments are deeply reluctant to get into that phraseology. It often means referendums to take place. In some countries, it's an automatic referendum. The Netherlands is an example. I think France has a referendum, Ireland a referendum. Other countries make commitments that they will, if there's any big new changes, and especially after Lisbon, that they would put those to a referendum. So there is a big sort of central plank issue about the danger of referendums. Brexit is the way in which they think about it, is the thing they look at and say, well, hang on, that's what could happen in a referendum. So they have to get unanimity in all the countries. So first of all, it's about the challenge of just recognizing that the vote to achieve treaty change also opens up the Pandora's box of the EU generally. And I think, secondly, the experience of Lisbon is that it took a decade from the first discussions to actually complete the journey. And therefore, you have to assume that these things will not be quick. And some of the changes which we can talk about that would need to be made will be really controversial, really challenging, and will require some serious thinking about how the EU works. Because currently you have what you might call is a pretty flat structure. Every member state is treated more or less equally in terms of voting rights, not on everything. There is qualified majority voting, but on many things. The role of the European Parliament as a sort of co-legislator. Then you have how many participants you have in the European Parliament itself. And you get into this flat structure based on very clear criteria. Number of commissioners, one per country, and so on. If you're looking at treaty change, you sort of open up all of those questions. And the fear that many countries will have is that some are more equal than others.
I think that that's a very natural segue into looking at how the European Union might change over the next few years as it is trying to bring in Ukraine, and if those processes are happening as two parallel processes. What would you see them trying to tackle first in order to bring that along? And actually, I should say, I'm a big fan of process in this, because the process of joining the European Union changes countries, and it often assists them and speeds their progress to a more integrated government and integrated economic structure with the European Union. So I know that some criticize process, but I'm kind of a fan of it because it brings people together and brings these countries together in a way that is unachievable otherwise. But I'm going to turn it over to you as the expert.
Well, in terms of Ukraine itself, you know that the process will be process. This is the English American translation. That the process will be long, in that, I mean, there's much talk about should you have a kind of interim arrangement for Ukraine where they're kind of inside, but they're not a full member. I don't know what that means, but that's the sort of language that's being talked about. Because everybody knows that in order to bring your institutions, your legal framework and so on up to the standard of the EU can take, well, a decade. Countries that have been through this process know very well that it's not cost-free, in that it changes quite a lot of the framework in which you operate. You have to tackle corruption, you have to sort out your judicial system, you have to deal with your legal framework matching that of Europe's, and you have to bring in the laws that are necessary to implement the single market, and so on. So there's a great deal to do. Now, the EU is really good at helping countries to achieve that, both financially and actually in terms of people who know how to do it, but it's not quick. And if you think about Ukraine as a war-devastated country, with its infrastructure in ruins in many places, with its capacity to do things less good than it was because there are fewer people available. A lot of people are fighting, a lot of people have left, a lot of dramatic changes have happened in that society. And it's going to be a war-weary country at the end when all of this is finished. So there's an awful lot more to do in that sense for them. So I think the first thing will happen there will be some sort of assessment of where we can start. I mean, they're looking at what they call opening chapters already, and they're looking at it in terms of groups of chapters. The chapters simply mean an area of policy. It can be foreign policy, it can be justice, it can be any aspect of the single market and so on. So there's things they can get on with, but nonetheless, it's not necessarily going to be a very quick process. And that's not what Ukraine wants. Ukraine wants to get there, wants to feel part of it and reap the benefits, and that's understandable. So that's going to be quite an interesting challenge. Hence, I think people saying, well, perhaps there's a kind of halfway house. We'll see. And in terms of the EU, which is the other side of it, they're going to have to look at each stage of this as to what changes are going to happen in the European Union, because it's not just Ukraine, as you rightly say. There are other countries who will feel they've been waiting longer, who need to be thought about in this context. And also there are big changes just with Ukraine in terms of how some of the policies work. And the obvious one that always springs to my mind is the common agricultural policy.
I agree that also because Ukraine is an agricultural powerhouse, and so bringing in an agricultural powerhouse to the EU necessarily raises questions over how sustainable that policy is. And I also know that it's sort of the third rail of EU politics, right? When you talk about the agricultural policy. But I think that all of this is something where we can see that Ukraine brings things to the European Union as well, and maybe this is a catalyst for change that might otherwise have happened more slowly. I think back to, when the structures of the European Union were being created, which has been a continuous process over time, of course. But looking at that, I'm not sure that the folks involved in the EU 50 years ago would have imagined the EU as it is today. And that makes me wonder how you see the EU 50 years from now. What would that look like? How do you see the European Union operating in the world 50 years from now? This gives us a chance to look into a crystal ball a little bit and also imagine what would be a very productive European Union in the world of 50 years hence.
I think it's hard to be sure because we live in times that are reasonably uncertain. And I will begin from the premise that the European Union is such an obviously good concept that beyond what's happened in Britain, nobody else is going to leave it. The geography of Europe, in any event, makes it almost impossible to conceive that individual countries sitting in the middle of the continent would find any benefit in not being part of the EU. So although you may have populist governments who take a dim view of the EU, it's quite difficult to imagine that we'll have got to that point. So I'm beginning to the premise that all of the countries currently in the EU remain there. And in 50 years' time, all of the countries that we've talked about that have decided they want to be part of the EU will be inside it. So I'm confident about the Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, assuming that's what they want at that point, because we talk about it as if it's sort of a done, given thing, but not with every country will it remain so. Turkey, I speculate, I'm not sure where Turkey will be in 50. It's not inconceivable that it will be part of the EU, but it's also possibly more likely that it will still be around the EU, but not part of it. So in terms of membership, I think it will have completed its journey sometime before. It will be by then a massive economic powerhouse, particularly if you take somewhere like Ukraine, where the original association agreement was designed to try and support, for example, their industry in IT. This is a country that's got a huge amount to offer, not least in lithium and other minerals that are needed. It also, of course, is a great breadbasket. It has the capacity to feed large portions of the world. Indeed, we see this because of all the challenges around grain at the moment, not least between Ukraine and members of the EU itself. And it has potential to develop industries and energy and so on and so forth. So it has the capacity to have helped and supported the EU to have developed even further, to be a place of great investment, a place that is contributing to the economic strength. So an economic powerhouse that will be unrivaled in terms of that in that context, especially in our part of the world. That makes it possible for the EU to play a bigger and better role in the different elements of foreign and security policy. Its relationship with China will be different. Its relationship with the US will be different. Still partners, but I think different because it'll be bigger and stronger. And I think it will by then have identified for itself how it fits and sits within the world. Because one of the things we've identified, have we not, from what's happened in the Ukraine crisis, is that assumptions we have made about support from different parts of the world automatically being given to the Ukraine people has not happened in the way that we would have wished. It doesn't mean lots of people don't support Ukraine, but it does mean it hasn't been an automatic understanding that this was an invasion of a democratic country, and that therefore those of us who believe in those values must stand together, that democracy, freedom, sovereignty, and so on are critical elements of how we view the world. So Europe will hopefully have been able to have played a big part in that. But it's hard to know because even where you think you have something that is very stable, it's very easy for something to happen, particularly within individual countries, that sort of changes the tone or the direction or holds things back a little bit. And we're in quite an uncertain period coming up when you look at the elections coming up in a variety of countries. We've got the European elections next year, we have the elections in Britain and in America, will be followed by France and so on. The consistent churning of political leadership within Europe brings us challenges too.
You know, it makes it all the more important that we also look at working on that deep democracy that you talk about so much in your book, and how important that is as the real foundation also for the Europe of the future and 50 years from now. You've given us a lot to think about, Cathy, with this, and I thank you so much for taking the time to be with us as part of this discussion today. You know that we'll be coming back to you with future questions about how the European Union is tackling some of these issues, but I really thank you for your insights as part of our Ukraine and Europe initiative. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.